another podcast following up on the topic about feedback in English language teaching or English language classrooms, right, where students are not learning English as a foreign language or second language, but we are focusing here on the learning of English as a foreign language, specifically in Brazilian contexts. So keeping with what we've been talking about so far, the thing about feedback and how important feedback is and the purpose that feedback serves in the language learning environment. So there's one thing I want to talk about here is the idea of one of the myths that still haunts most of our students, right? In language classrooms that adhere to the communicative principles of teaching, feedback is often limited to error correction. And it may seem obvious to comment on what students can already do with the language, right? Not just on those inaccuracies they insist on making. But when we attend classes, feedback is usually limited to dealing with errors. A quick aside here, I feel it might be important to point out that dealing with inaccurate use of language requires teachers' understanding of the difference between mistakes and errors. The first is a slip that occurs due to non-linguistic factors. For example, urgency to get your message across, the register of the communicative situation, formal, neutral, informal or conversational, the level of nervousness or anxiety to perform the task successfully, etc. The second reveals us a lack of understanding of the rules on the part of the student. That is, they may not have internalized the structures or might not have been exposed to them. So when faced with these inaccuracies, they need to decide if we are going to deal with them at that moment of the lesson or not. Another point that puts a student at disadvantage is we don't explicitly inform our students what we are going to look out for while they're doing a speaking task. In other words, you don't tell them we want to hear them use the language they just learned. Our discussion here focuses on what we all know as controlled practice speaking activities, in which the aim is to assess how well students have grasped the target language of the lesson. That said, the proposition of this podcast is the fact that we focus only on what students were not able to do correctly in terms of language after they've performed a speaking task. This reinforces the myth that our adult learners in particular firmly hold on to. If I'm making mistakes, then I'm not learning or making progress. If and when the event is frustration, we normally reassure them that making mistakes is part of the process. These are comforting words which, considering the way we deal with their oral production, fall on deaf ears. What should we do then, especially if we're dealing with lower levels that might not be able to produce any accurate example of language? The first step is making them aware what you're going to listen out for while they talk. The more aware they are of the expected outcomes, they will most likely strive to get it right. After all, awareness leads to responsibility. The second step is letting them know they should be prepared to do the task again if necessary. We should cater our lesson plans enough time for students to do the task a first and a second time. I know this is not easy. That is why we have to specifically plan for this in our lesson. The third step is to ask students why they think they were not able to produce the target language. This could be a quick discussion in mother tongue, or for the sake of time, prepare a quick poll on slips of paper for them to fill in and hand in. The poll could ask them to tick from a list of options or to write freely what they found difficult about the activity. The fourth and final step is to comment on their communicative competence. How well they're able to interact, to ask follow-up questions, to improvise when necessary. Whenever they work in pairs or groups, students need to be reminded that speaking activities work on two main aspects of language: linguistic and communicative competence. So highlighting the latter can compensate low levels of the former, especially with beginner and intermediate students. So to sum up then, the feedback we give is fundamental to help our students work on their confidence to use the language and to bust the myths they firmly believe in.